Hi, this lecture presents an overview of the thought of the Chinese philosopher Xunzi. He's a philosopher that comes after Xunzi, the previous philosopher that we considered, and he's also in the Confucian tradition, but he differs quite a bit from Xunzi, and he ends up not being as influential in the Neo-Confucian period, but many philosophers today are really interested in his thought, primarily because he writes in a style that is more familiar. So whereas Confucius, Xunzi, and others, their texts were really in the dialogue form or in the form of sayings, Xunzi really presents arguments, and he entertains objections, responds to those objections with arguments, and so on. This lecture will focus on Xunzi's conception of human nature. To begin, it's helpful to situate Xunzi with respect to his predecessors. So recall that prior philosophers all agreed on a starting assumption. The starting assumption is that we ought to act in accordance with human nature. You figure out what human nature is, and then you play up human nature. Xunzi questions that starting assumption. He thinks, as we'll see, that human nature is bad, and so we shouldn't embrace it. Rather, we need to change our nature. We need to reform ourselves and get rid of the various bad aspects of ourselves. So recall that Xunzi questioned various assumptions of the Yangists and others. Xunzi follows that in the Confucian tradition by attacking Confucian starting assumptions. Although it's important to note that Xunzi would have thought that Confucius himself was more in line with Xunzi's own view, so he's not claiming to do something novel here. He's just claiming that he has a better understanding of what Confucius thought. So, what is human nature for Xunzi? Well, he gives a variety of marks in chapter 22 of his work. So he says, human nature is, quote, that which is so by birth, end quote. So the idea there is just whatever you have at birth without nurture, without training, without environmental effects, all those sorts of things, just what you have at birth. That's what counts as human nature. But Xunzi gives a few other clarifications of what human nature is. For example, he compares human nature with the idea of stimulus and response. And here I think it's useful to think in terms of reflexes. Reflexes that require no effort, that just happen automatically. And he says, produced by the harmonious operation of nature. So it's produced by nature rather than us. In other terms, he puts it, an accomplishment of heaven. Again, it's what heaven does, not what we do, not what's in our control. Now, Xunzi primarily identifies human nature as consisting in a variety of dispositions, things that we are inclined to do, various dispositions toward feelings, toward actions, toward having certain desires, and so on. So that's what we have at birth, is just these potentialities to have feelings, to perform actions, and so on. And so it's those dispositions that make up human nature. And as he's going to go on to say that human nature is bad, it's those dispositions that lead to bad things. Before seeing why Xunzi thinks that human nature is bad, it's helpful to focus on what Xunzi thinks is opposed to human nature and what will help us overcome human nature. As we just saw, human nature is something not in our control. So what is opposed to human nature is what's in our control, that is to say, our effort. And not just any sort of effort that we make, but rather deliberate effort. So he's going to use that key notion of deliberate effort to explain the process of self-cultivation. So let us break down the two components of that notion of deliberate effort. Effort is something that comes from us rather than human nature. But the notion of deliberate is something that requires a little bit more explanation. So deliberate comes from the notion, the action of deliberation. So he explains it as follows, quote, when there is a certain disposition and the heart makes a choice on its behalf, this is called deliberation, end quote. So note that deliberation involves making a choice. Often in English, we'll talk about deliberating about something, reflecting on a certain situation in order to figure out what to do, in order to come to a choice. You weigh pros and cons and that sort of stuff. And notice here, it's in response to those dispositions. It's in response to the dispositions that you have in virtue of just being human. And we make a choice in response to those dispositions. We don't necessarily automatically act on those dispositions. And what makes the choice here in this translation is the heart. It's important to note that the notion here will sometimes get translated as heart-mind. And so there's kind of a difference between Western and Chinese philosophy here. In Chinese philosophy, there's not a strict distinction between mind and body. And so the heart-mind kind of captures that idea because you have various emotions as well as rational thoughts all coming from the same faculty, the heart-mind. It's not that you have a rational mind that is quite distinct from your emotional life. Now, putting all this together, we see that deliberate effort overcomes human nature because it involves thinking through the dispositions that we otherwise would act automatically upon and making a focused, specific choice about whether to embrace those dispositions or not. And that choice comes from what Xunzi calls understanding. So it does come from a place of reasoning things through and figuring out what you actually approve of, what you actually disapprove of. You might disapprove of certain innate dispositions and approve of others, or decide to change your dispositions. And part of the process here will also involve training, engaging in ritual, and other sorts of things in order to make your decisions more stable and a matter of something like habit. So let us now turn to Xunzi's argument that human nature is bad, and so that we actually need to use such deliberate effort in order to lead a good, ethical, virtuous life. So Xunzi's argument focuses on how we would act sort of in a state of nature prior to a society. So we can identify what comes from our nature rather than from society. And so looking at people in that sort of situation, independently of a society, he identifies various dispositions. These include primarily three that are the focus of his argument: fondness for profit, feelings of hate and dislike, a disposition to have those feelings, and then a disposition to have various sensual desires, whether food, drink, sex, and so on, and disposition to act on those desires. And so what he does is, with these three different dispositions, he points out that if we were to act on them, bad things will happen. So with the fondness for profit, for example, it would lead to struggle and contention. If I act seeking to get more stuff for myself and you act in the same way, and there's no sort of civilization there to regulate, to punish us for doing certain things, then we're going to fight over certain things. And then what's the result for our character? Well, our character is not virtuous. Our character would be lacking in yielding and deference, which he thinks are part of the virtuous life. Similarly, with the feelings of hate and dislike, those will lead to cruelty and villainy. You'll engage in cruel behavior against others, and then that leads to a lack of virtues such as loyalty and trustworthiness. And then finally, if you were to act on those sensual desires, then what will result is chaos. Someone acting upon just sensual desires will not have order in their life and will create disorder in other people's lives. And so what will be lacking there are things like ritual, standards of rightness, and just good order in general. Now let us take what we've done so far and put it in the form of an argument so that we can see how Xunzi thinks he establishes his doctrine that human nature is bad. In rough outline, the argument runs as follows. First, he says what human nature consists in. So this is the account earlier that I gave, just defining what he means by human nature. Human nature consists in the various dispositions that we have at birth and that we act automatically upon without deliberate effort. Now turning to the second premise identifies what specific dispositions that we have. What are they like, diagnosing whether they are good or bad. And so we can identify those dispositions by considering ourselves independently of society, and then we discover that if human beings act on those dispositions, then the result is a lot of bad stuff. It's struggle, contention, disorder, violence. So acting on the dispositions we have at birth and not sort of modifying them, not engaging in deliberate efforts to change them, will result in bad things. And so what that tells us is that human nature is bad. Human nature, sort of undiluted, pure human nature, not changed by our deliberate efforts, that will result in bad things. And so that's the argument. Now there's a corollary of this argument which builds on this argument and points out how we can actually become better and overcome that human nature. So if we recognize that human nature is bad, what is opposed to human nature, as has been explained before, is deliberate effort. And those deliberate efforts will take the form of what Confucius prescribed, which is engaging in human rituals and figuring out what sorts of conventions are better than others. And so deliberate effort is the way to become virtuous, is the way to cultivate yourself. In the remainder of the lecture, I'm going to say just a few things to fill out this account of self-cultivation. To begin, Xunzi gives a very helpful metaphor that shows how he's different from someone like Mengzi. So Xunzi says, quote, "Through steaming and bending, you can make wood straight as a plumb line into a wheel. And after its curve conforms to the compass, even when parched under the sun, it will not become straight again, because the steaming and bending have made it a certain way." End quote. So the idea is that the original piece of wood has a particular shape, and that shape is not good. It's not helpful for the purpose that we want to use it for. For example, having a wheel. So what do we need to do to the piece of wood? Not something organic, but this very drastic step, this step that requires human effort, steaming and bending. So you steam the wood, you loosen it up, and then you bend it through manipulating it. And that's what we ought to do with ourselves. Manipulate ourselves through human inventions, ritual and convention, to change our nature. And eventually, those efforts will result in a stable habit for doing good things. So this is why he says at the end of this passage that the steaming and bending have made it a certain way, that it will stay that way even despite all the elements from the environment it might undergo. Now, as I've indicated throughout this lecture, the way to change ourselves is through ritual and convention. So we need to see why he thinks ritual and convention can work. Xunzi identifies something else that is distinctively human. So whereas human nature involves a variety of dispositions that are sometimes shared with other animals, there's something about being human that's different. And so what is that for Xunzi? It's having distinctions. And that notion might be a little vague at first, but he clarifies it in a few different ways. So he says, quote, "That by which humans are human is not that they are special in having 2 legs and no feathers, but that they have distinctions." This passage is similar to the ancient Greek idea that human being is not merely a featherless biped, but rather a rational animal. And indeed, that's what we find in Xunzi, basically, is that having distinctions comes from having a faculty of reason. And so that fits very well with that earlier notion of deliberation. And this gets explained further in terms of differentiation. So he says, quote, "The birds and the beasts have feathers and sons, but not the intimate relationship of father and son. They have the male sex and the female sex, but no differentiation between male and female." So the idea there is that birds and beasts might have differences between each other, that there might be a difference between male and female among animals, but that's not differentiation. Notice that this notion of differentiation is coming from a verb, to differentiate, to distinguish. And so we distinguish things often through language, through reasoning about different matters. And so animals might have differences between each other, but human beings can be conscious of differences and make choices about what differences matter, to deliberate using a faculty of reason about which differences are relevant and which differences are good, which differences are bad. So what all this means is that in cultivating ourselves, we need to use deliberate effort, where deliberate effort is going to result from rationally thinking through important and relevant differences. But on Xunzi's view, this isn't simply thinking about matters for oneself. Rather, it's thinking through matters in the context of the Confucian traditions. And accordingly, he says, quote, "Of distinctions, none are greater than social divisions. And of social divisions, none are greater than rituals. And of those, none are greater than of the sage kings." So the basic idea here is that the traditional rituals provided by these ancient sage kings, people that Confucius himself appealed to as figuring out the best way of life, it's those ancient rituals that we ought to use as a good guide for deliberating about our own efforts, our own choices to make about how to lead a good life.